So today we are going to talk about generator functions, which are new in ES6 and are a great way for you to just write better code that you will enjoy looking at a lot more than the code you might be used to writing with some of the tools that we currently have available. So to start off, let's talk about some scenarios we're familiar with. We all went through this in junior phase, dealing with situations like this, where when we started to use Node, because this is the way that asynchronous continuous operations traditionally happen in JavaScript, you have to call a function that says whenever you get the result of this function back, then this is the next function that you call, and slowly as you go forward, you're constructing this pyramid where you read the file and you count the lines, then you sum the values within it, they do some other stuff, you build the pyramids, which is funny because this is kind of a pyramid shape here. You keep going, but the whole point is that if you miss one of these brackets or parentheses, you could spend a really long time trying to figure out exactly where you missed it, and your code won't help you as much as you'd think it would, because it tells you the errors in some other file where there's an unexpected token or some other line of code, which makes it really difficult to debug and makes it hard to read and understand, which is kind of the point of maintaining good code. Promises are better. The code seems to flow synchronously. This is a bit of code from my stack store. It's better than the callback because you can read it. You can read through it and still make logical sense thanks to .then, because in our minds, .then means after you do this, .then do something else. But it still requires a decent amount of brain power to really think through and visualize what any of this means, which is where generators come in. What's really important about generators is that they can hide away a lot of the weird tricks we have to do with things like callbacks or promises, because they can pause themselves during execution. They're a great way to simulate synchronous code execution using something called a finite state machine that I'm not really going to get into. But it dramatically expands the amount of control that you have over your code. So here's the obligatory hello world slide. The most important thing about generators is this yield keyword here, which tells a generator when to stop functioning. Now, a generator is actually a constructor function. By the way, you denote that a function is a generator function with this cool little star here. It's a special function. So when we call gen1 by declaring it, setting it equal to the gen over here, that stores the gen as an instance of our generator gen1. Then we have to start the generator with this initial call to next. This will run our generator function until it gets to its first yield statement, which itself will return not just the value in question, but an object containing the value and the state of the generator. That is, this value is a string and done is false, because the generator tracks how far along its execution path it is. And whatever we're returning at the end with the second call to next, when the generator hits a return statement, that value gets stored here, and done becomes true because the generator has finished its execution. If we don't include a return statement, for example, this last object here would have a value of undefined, but done would still be true. It's a great way of understanding that the generator always returns something. It just might not be what you want it to be, which is true of anything, really. This one's more of a side note. There's a new version of the for loop for generators where you can loop through all of a generator's yield statements by saying var x of generator function, which is an interesting way of possibly doing it in the future. Now, important thing about generators is that you can control them from outside by passing data into the next function. Here we're setting the value of x to whatever comes back into the generator when you yield back control back to it. So here, we have our question, var x, what's the easiest object-oriented way to become wealthy? We pass in an answer, A, inheritance, which is then console logged. Now, having to type next all the time can itself be a little bit, it might not be what we want to do. So we can tell generators when to start and stop execution with other generators. We do that with the yield star keyword, which tells a generator to yield control back to itself by when the generator you pass it has completed. That sentence was kind of confusing, so I'm going to walk through this code and explain. We have our gen4 function, which has your string original, that we console log, and we set x equal to the result of yield star string changer, which is also a generator function. Now, whenever the string changer function finishes running, it will return that value back to x in Gen 4, and Gen 4 will just continue running without us having to call next or anything like that. And then it's returned, and then we get the value back out of it in the long run. But really, what's the point of all this? There we go. How do we turn this into asynchronous magic? Because these are just objects. There's nothing native to ES6 that really tells you when a function is asynchronous or not. So we need a bit of code to tell a generator how to behave when it receives an asynchronous operation. Now, here is a simple example of the kind of function you would need to do it. There are libraries like Co out there that implement this on a much deeper level. They do things like error handling and post-processing. And it does this by abstracting away the .thens in a long promise chain you might want to write. So we have our generator runner function here. You instantiate the generator in this iter variable, and then you wrap an iterate function using an iffy to check what you instantiate the generator, because this first call to next is empty, which means you start it. If it's not done yet, so if done, that object you get back, if done is false, you check if it's a promise, doesn't have a .then method. Then you iterate .then. Once the promise resolves, recursively call this function with whatever value you get back, which could be a promise, in which case you keep going through the loop. Otherwise, you have a value, so you just send it back in. And you keep going through this loop until it's finished. Now, this allows us to abstract away a lot of the content that you might normally see in an asynchronous operation. I have an example to show you in a minute. But first, I want to talk about Koa.js, which is behind the guys who wrote Express.js that we all know and love, and is a different way of thinking about servers and middleware. The way this works is that control is passed downstream. I don't know if y'all can read that. Control is passed downstream through each yield statement. That does not help at all. So there's a yield statement in this app.use here where it will break and move on to the next piece of middleware, where it says start, new date, yield next. This is a piece of logging middleware. And when it hits a function that actually returns something, this is setting the body of the response to hello world, for example, it will bubble back up the chain and execute these two lines of code, which will then return and bubble back up and execute these two lines of code, which provides you a way of simplifying all the middleware you might want to write into code that's a lot more readable. So I have an example to show you. In the process of researching this talk, I realized that there are not enough, how should I say it? There are not enough good JavaScript jokes out there. So I wrote this last night. It's this little JavaScript joke generator. It's a little Angular app. And that's the wrong HTML file. And, it's pretty simple, controller, whatever. And so if we go to localhost, we have our joke generator. Yeah. So that's one. Here's another one. Anyway, here's the HTML. It's pretty simple Angular stuff that we all know and very familiar with by the end of Stack Store at this point. So here's our controller. Here's our runner function from earlier. I don't know if you all can. You probably can. That's much better. Here's our runner function from earlier, which will run whatever generator we pass it. And here is the entirety of our controller, just run with generators. What you do is we have scope.getJoke, which is invoked when you click that getJoke button, which will call our runner function on by just yielding the result of http.get. Nothing will happen until we get that result back, which is how we can say scope.currentJoke is response.data instead of receiving undefined as you would in another context. More importantly, this is a lot easier to read and easier to make sense of than going .then, whatever the response is, which requires less brain power when you read it. I also have this submit joke function that operates very similarly. Now, that allows us to do something like that. Oh, I already got that one. Yeah. Think about that one for a minute. And this is coming soon to Heroku, so you all can submit your own. So here's the back end. Here's the server. I have my little database here that, Mongo coming soon. Anyway, I have Koa installed for this app. And it requires something here, something there, static, middleware, router, body parser. It comes a lot more modular than Express does. But here is the entirety of my backend. I have app.use body parser. I have a piece of logging middleware that will attach these 2 lines of code to the end of everything. But first, it will calculate a start date. I have serving up index.html and the controller script. Then I have a router.get to joke and gets a random number, pulls from the index. Same thing with our post method, and then listens on 3000. And it's a much simpler, cleaner way of writing what might be an Express server. And I think the short version is just that if you want to write code that's easier to make sense of and easier to debug, start looking at this stuff, because it'll make your life a lot easier. Thank you.